I'm Don Francis. I was actually, way back, was trained as a pediatrician, and then, interestingly, got involved with the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. You'd appreciate this from Canada, was that it was the Vietnam War era, and I was moving to Canada. And they said, well, why don't you go to CDC for 2 years for, quote, military service? And I went to CDC for 2 years and stayed for 21, stationed all the way around the world, chasing a variety of epidemics. Ultimately retired after 21 years and returned to California to work on a variety of things in our vaccine arena. Not only was I an epidemiologist in the 80s, but I was an epidemiologist with CDC studying a new vaccine for hepatitis B to see if it worked. And what group did we choose to study was half a dozen cities around the United States with hepatitis B vaccine in gay men. And so we had almost 2,000 gay men that we were following in these clinics from east to west, north to south. And we got a call, I did, that, you know, Don, we've got this new disease in these people. Not only was that interesting in terms of talking to the people, but we had bloods on these people that went back years before, that we had followed them monthly or every 3 months for years. And so we know we had a very important epidemiologic study straight away, as soon as we got the bug, that we could do studies to see when it came in, what it's causing, what the natural history is. And that was terribly important because we were accustomed to those studies we were doing with hepatitis B virus. There you have to the major challenge with hepatitis B is cancer of the liver. There you got a 30-year incubation period. And so we were already getting accustomed to these late manifestations of viral infections. And we knew that HIV already, we could tell from even before we had the test that the incubation period was long. But once we were collaborating with the French and got the, at that time called LAV from Institut Pasteur, I flew off to France and we started working with them. And we had freezers full of thousands of specimens prospectively collected on gay men in 5 different cities all the way across the United States. So we could define the epidemiology of HIV within months. And then we could actually see the natural history because we would go find these people, bring them back into the studies and follow their immune systems in, what, 2 or 3 cities. And very rapidly determine what we could make a mathematical projection of what the natural history was, and we were shocked. It didn't take long with HIV to see that it was a blood-borne illness because really we saw it was a sexually transmitted disease in gay men, but very rapidly came the transfusion-associated cases where a donor, usually a gay man, or a group of donors donated their blood, and the person comes down with, who received the transfusions, came down. So the transfusion-associated AIDS put the blood part, helped put the blood part together. The other thing is, the IV drug users came really at the same time as the gay men. So we knew, from hepatitis B, we knew what the epidemiology was within months. It didn't take long at all. We put it together as blood and sexually transmitted disease. But to be honest, you know, blood was a very small proportion of the transmission, and transfusion-associated AIDS was 1%. And so, to be honest, from my standpoint from CDC, we were much more interested in the other 99% of cases. And really, I sat down with the blood bankers and said, you know, this is the issue. You got 1–2% of cases, and it's straightforward where it comes from. You already exclude IV drug users, and the rest of them are gay men that we've associated with the cases of, as we interviewed the cases of transfusion-associated AIDS. So you have to exclude gay men from donating blood, and hasta luego, off I went to deal with other, 99% of cases. I dealt with the blood bankers in years past with hepatitis and knew they were not what you'd call an activist group responsible. They were doing with their tests and they were doing with screening of these individuals in their own area. They were responsible. But when it came to saying you don't want gay men to donate blood, they were very, very dull and reluctant to, it's one thing asking for histories of needle use or past histories of turning yellow, but to ask them about if they're a male, have they had sex with another male, they're very reluctant. And yet that's where the risk was. And to be honest, we had 99% of the other cases to deal with, and I just assumed blood bankers would take it on. But then when I would touch base again or come back to them or they would call me, I was shocked at the lack of trouble that they would take to protect the recipients of their blood, because they frankly don't deal with the recipients. They deal with the donors. So their customers are the donors. And their money comes from the donors, and their trouble comes from stirring up resistance in the donors, which is silly, because all they had to do, and we would be happy, we told them from CDC side, to call from donors of women who've had no sex with anybody to come and be a blood donor. We knew thousands would come. And yet they were so reluctant and so stuck in the mud with their system that they had an awful hard time adjusting. And so they continued to not ask the questions appropriately, and some of their most loyal donors were gay men, which is wonderful, but just ask them if they're gay men, don't donate blood, and they would. They would stop me here, they're doing good. They're not out there to do harm. And these doofuses in the blood system just carried on. And the thousands of people who died really without any reason are just a negative tribute to their dullness and lack of response that we from the public health expert side had told them what they needed to do. It was pretty straightforward. And for reasons that I still don't understand, we're reluctant to, for a long while, to exclude gay donor. Ultimately, we got the virus and the antibody test, and they get excluded through the antibody test. But at that time, it was really excluded by asking the history that we were asking people by thousands in the public health side about what kind of behavior they did. So we were very comfortable, and so were the sexually transmitted disease clinic, and so would be the blood transfusion people if they had just, I hate to say this, but taken the trouble. Not only was it god-awful, it was deadly, it was libelous, it was stupid. I, to this day, do not understand why. Why would you not essentially use the same logic you do for screening donors anyway to decrease the risk of hepatitis or whatever other disease we were screening with at that time? Not to mention to use the AIDS issue to recruit donors. Send in all the women, send in all the housewives, whatever you want if you want to avoid people who've had men with sex with other men. You could have used it to bring in donors by the thousands. And they saw it as change. And there are some, personalities that are selected for maintaining a given system, which I had worked a lot with Jonas Salk, who used the term maintainers and versus change agents. And blood bankers tend to be maintainers, and you need that. You need the maintainer in there so they do the right thing every time, day in and day out, in the collection system. But you need the change agent above who's looking at the future. And they didn't have that. And as a result, thousands of people died. If you look at the the regulation or the standard making groups for blood banks. Yes, the government's involved, but by and large, those, quote, government committees that are overseeing or making the recommendations are really blood bankers. Now, they're not necessarily self-regulated, but they have the expertise. They are the experts. They're blood bankers. And so in both Canadian and U.S., the committees that were overseeing the blood banking community are mostly blood bankers themselves, and in both countries, the United States and Canada. I guess we saw that as reasonable. But when it came to making change, it was very obvious in both the United States and Canada that that was not reasonable, that that the higher authorities had to say, you've got to make the change. But to be frank, AIDS was a time of huge crisis. There were people dying in both countries, and 1% of them or so were transfusion associated. So we had 98, 98% of the cases, 99% of the cases that you had to deal with first. And so the blood banks were going to be taken care of by themselves. Were the governments duplicitous in terms of their response to AIDS in general, let's start with. And I think it depends on what country. I think Canada had a much better view of what public responsibility was than the United States. I mean, many Canadians would complain if you look at all the deaths and the time it took. But the United States was really atrocious too. In terms of the blood side, interestingly, why in both Canada and in the United States was the assumption that they would take care of themselves to an extent, and that the, quote, regulators from the government, if you looked at who staffed those committees and things, were really the folks to be regulated were the members of the boards that were making these recommendations. And the sad thing here is, I think, from my bias, because there was lots of good people in blood banks, but they were selected to go into blood banking not from the change agent side, but from the maintainer side. They have to be very thorough in how you screen for donors, how you test their blood, how you be sure that the blood cross matches with the recipient and it all goes well, and then you follow the recipients to be sure they don't have reactions. It's a, I hate to say this, it's kind of a downstream phenomenon. You have to be a regulator that makes sure that A goes to patient A prime and it's all tested, and then follow and see if there's any side effects and get the whole thing together and repeat it over and over and over again. It's very important and very thorough system. That's very different, the person who does that, compared to the person who says, well, let's think about a better way to do this. How could we do it better? That's a change agent in my vocabulary versus a maintainer. And to be honest, at CDC, when I had 1% of the cases that were transfusion-associated AIDS, I said, let those experts in transfusion take care of that, and we'll deal with the 90% of the cases that are in the United States, when we have a lot more challenge in terms of changing behavior of IV drug users and gay men, et cetera, et cetera. It was really a mistake, and I was familiar with working in hepatitis with the transfusion-associated people and the blood banks. But they were knowledgeable folks in terms of what needed to be done, how to do it, and get the right blood to the right person, yada, yada, yada. But I didn't think that to make them make decisions of change would be so difficult when you had a disease we didn't know at that time was 100% fatal, but we knew it was 50, 60, 70, depending on the time of follow-up of HIV-infected people, that this was a deadly bug. And I'd been all around the world working at making national and international programs for vaccinations and control of diseases that had 1%, 2%, 5%, 10% mortality. Not one that had this kind. So it was clearly a disease that should have been at the top of everyone's list of to be prevented. And blood banks just couldn't deal with that change. Well, clearly the inertia for change and changing blood collection, blood testing before transfusions had mixed responsibility. Clearly, the ultimate responsibility in terms of practice is with the blood bankers themselves. But they are under regulatory authority of governments, be they the United States or Canada or anywhere. Interestingly, in both places, I guess it's not surprising that in both the United States and Canada, that the groups that regulated the blood banks were often people from the blood banks were on the committees that made the recommendations for the governments how to regulate. Now, some of that's you have to do because you have to have the expertise within in that case, the blood collection and testing expertise. But when it came to safety, it's really the recipients that are the ones that should be on those committees, and it's the general public that got them. And in some cases, there was a representative or two, but really they were regulatory authorities regulating themselves. And some of this, in my estimation, was not malicious, but ignorance. And it should not have happened in the blood banking sector because there were long incubation period diseases that they dealt with years. I mean, take hepatitis B with cancer of the liver 30 years after infection. They really thought about, and not to mention what we call non-B hepatitis, which is hepatitis C. These are long incubation period diseases. So they were accustomed to long incubation period, and they're not doing a discount rate of 5% a year in terms of the value. They know that we should prevent these things. But they probably also know that they could ignore it, and people expected to get these diseases, and they've always got them, and they will get them from transfusions, but it's worth it because they survived the transfusion. It was safe as we can make it, but it does have a side effect, yada, 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 yada. But that all changed with HIV. Now you had a long incubation period disease that had, depends on what time you're thinking about it, but high mortality. And ultimately, 100% mortality if you wait long enough. And to be honest, we knew that at CDC because the cohorts of people that we were following, especially gay men, where we had the most information, we had bloods that went back in our freezers for a long while. And we could see that the damage that HIV was causing to their immune systems was great and highly prevalent for those people that were tested positive for the virus. So we didn't know that it was going to approach 100%. There are very few viruses that killed. I mean, you got to go to Ebola or something like that to see 100%. But with 100% fatal short incubation period diseases like Ebola, people run away and they stop it. All you have to do is put a 10, 20-year incubation period in front of that and they don't run away. It's fascinating that we adjust to risk in probably the wrong way of saying, well, if it's 10 years, at least I have 10 years, instead of saying, if it's going to kill me in 10 years, I don't want it, I have to avoid it. And it's a fascinating denial when it comes to long incubation period diseases, and HIV was critical there in terms of lack of interest in stopping it. I don't know at what side of the border 1 in a million came from, but I would have suspected it came from blood bank meetings in the United States where the Canadians came to visit or collaborate with. And I don't know where it came from. It came from the fact that you had 1 case of AIDS in 1 million transfusion recipients. So It was 1 in a million. Without understanding a long incubation period diseases, that underneath that one case is another 100 or 10 or whatever it is. And you know it straight away. Anybody using their right mind who didn't want to downplay it would say it's much greater than 1 in a million, but it's significant because if you get it, you die. And it was just, and we knew it at the time when the blood banks in the United States, like the blood banks in Canada, were saying 1 in a million. It just didn't make sense. Because with relatively early studies, we showed that there was a lot more than that underneath the clinical expressed tip of the iceberg. Is a lot of cases of infection that we knew a lot of them would be cases of AIDS given time. So it made no sense. From the day it was said, it made no sense because we knew all of that beforehand. But both in the United States, both north and south of the border, that same term was used over and over again by picked up from somebody who said it in a conference. Just because there was one case from 1 million transfusions the first 2 weeks of the outbreak with a long incubation period disease, you know, it's like saying in a forest fire that we've lost one tree. Just wait. Well, I was contacted by the Krever Commission that they were going to examine the Canadian side of transfusion-associated AIDS. And I was more than pleased to get an airplane and come, because here Canada had the good sense of appointing someone like Justice Krever, who was serious to do his job, but the committee's job, of seriously looking at the situation, coming from a totally unbiased view of what happened and could we have done it better, and the next time can we do it better. And that was remarkable from my standpoint, coming from the south of the border, where as far as I could tell, I mean, we had huge numbers of AIDS cases and lots of problems with AIDS, but the transfusion-associated groups, as far as I could see, just said, oh, we did our best and so be it. When we had a worse situation than Canada had by a long shot, and worse in terms of, I think the Canadian blood banks, at least in different places, took it very much more seriously than did in the United States. And so it was wonderful to see Canada taking it on and looking at it from an independent and clearly the committee and certainly the leader was remarkable in the challenge and looking especially south of the border how it was essentially buried and yet went on with a remarkable report. I mean, the reason that I was so eager, truly eager, to fly all the way north to testify was that this really had not been done in very many countries around the world in a way that needed to be done. And the reasons I can only speculate were, well, the blood banks are always good people, they do their job, let's not, you know, who wants to be in blood banking anyway, let's, you know, leave them alone. Yes, it was bad, yada, 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 yada. But that was not right. These guys ignored the data, ignored the risk, these guys being the blood bankers in general. And that was true maybe less in Canada, but certainly in the United States, and certainly in Canada, that a lot of people died essentially unnecessarily because we continued to get high-risk donors into the blood system and no one looked at it before we had an HIV test. Just inexcusable, because gay men don't donate blood to be evil. Ask them if they've had sexual intercourse, ask the male if he's had intercourse with another man, and if they are, they say, thank you very much, we're not going to take your blood today, and let everyone know, and they will understand that. And they did when it happened. The gay community's always been incredibly cooperative with this. So we know you're not infected maybe, but we don't know at this stage. And so, and frankly with hepatitis B and other things that gay men were at risk for, it was very reasonable to begin with. Unfortunately, gay men being good people were very good blood donors. And so some of this came from the blood banks that said, you know, even though a few percent of the population is gay, we think a lot more of them are our blood donors, and so we're reluctant to have them donate blood. Oh my God. You know, with that information alone, you say, oh, we've got to. And then just go back to the community and say, would every virgin woman please donate blood? And you'd have thousands of people donating blood. But the blood bankers were not change agents, and that's true in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere. And the regulators were really blood bankers regulating blood bankers, because why would you need regulation in blood banking? These are good people trying their best. And as a result, thousands of people died around the world. I think the money trail in blood banking, it really has a couple of chapters or pieces. One is the plasma side of blood banking, where you donate plasma that is made into a variety of things, not blood, whole blood, but just the plasma itself, where frankly, at least in the United States, you pay donors to, you put a needle in, you take the blood out, you give the cells back, and you keep the plasma. That ended up to be a very dangerous thing, because you're really selecting people at lower socioeconomic status, and they have higher rates of blood-borne infections. So that was one side. From the blood side, though, it makes no sense. Again, if you just, one, blood can be divided into whole blood and plasma, so you can get your plasma from that too. In Canada or the United States, if you've spent 20 minutes on a TV interview in your hometown as a blood banker, you literally would have thousands of people lined up. And in neither place did they take the trouble of doing that. They said, that's going to be difficult. And it was silly. It would have benefited them in the long run, because you get safer donors, and they would line up by the thousands. I think the Krever Commission's assessment is exactly right. And I think you'd ask 100 people on the street and 90% of them would say the same thing. It's just the blood banks were stuck in their own, and this is true on both sides of the border and around the world, were stuck in their own system without thinking bigger and bringing in, and to be honest, it's opportunistic. AIDS was an incredible opportunity for blood banks to stand up and say, we need every person between such and such an age with such and such a risk to come to the blood banks tomorrow and sign up so we can be bleeding you for the next 5 years. And you wouldn't have to do any more recruiting. I mean, here you'd be in front page of the newspapers, and people would line up by the thousands. We'd selected, and it's somewhat appropriate, you tend to be selected for a program that's day in and day out the same kind of dull, let's get more donors, and do this or whatever. But here you have an opportunity. Here the fire was burning, and you as the fire department could say how important fire departments are. Here the fire of transfusion-associated AIDS was rampant, and you as the blood banks could do the same thing and say, let's get all people of this category into blood banks for the next couple of years and see what happens before we get a test or after we get a test, whatever it is, and donate blood if you are A, B, C, and D. Well, sorry, A, B, C, and D are also blood types, but if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 things, you know, whatever your criteria, which would be the safest donors in the world, suddenly you'd go to very, very safe donors, and everyone would volunteer, and they'd be happy to do it. I mean, the reason that I took the time to fly all the way to Canada to discuss an issue, which was, to be honest, straightforward, is because of the philosophy the Krever Commission set, not just for blood transfusion, but for other things. Let's, one, have a system that identifies them early and responds to them appropriately. And we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know what tomorrow's AIDS is going to be. But to have a philosophy that Canada has far better, frankly, than the United States, and is carried on to say, we need the Krever, whatever you want to call it, the Krever example, the Krever philosophy for automobiles, for trucks, for airplanes, whatever it may be. But let's use this philosophy of early intervention and recommendations for whatever is killing people. And frankly, not just new things that are killing people, but old things that are, shouldn't we look at these things periodically? And because they do change, and if we have possibilities of change to make them better, look at the safety of getting into a giant airplane and flying at 30, 40,000 feet and landing at a couple hundred miles an hour. Remarkable, because there are FAA type people that are looking at the safety of that all the time. And plus, a lot of us take that risk all the time, so we want to know that somebody's watching it. The same thing should be for all preventable things, that we have that base in our governments. The private sector does it for liability reasons, but when there's not liability for government organizations, the government should be doing it to prevent liability and improve the health or the traffic or whatever it may be. Why not? Why aren't we looking at introspectively at these things for safety, for number one, but convenience, for pollution, whatever it may be, especially the long-term things? I think that the reason that HIV was difficult, because I came into this field when transfusions with hepatitis, which had a few-week incubation period instead of a few years. And it's interesting that when you have a few-year incubation period, let's say a decade, let's say with pollution 2-3 decades, it's very difficult to get public interest. And so I think that the Krever type approach to a long incubation period disease should be thought of in terms of long incubation period phenomena, infectious or non-infectious, of how we as societies deal with these things and intervene as soon as we can. Because when you have industry, assuming that there's regulation, let's say causing pollution or disease or whatever it may be, they're looking for, to be honest, looking at government to do these things. So government should do it. And I think the population would support it. I think certainly in Canada, you had the Krever Commission. We've had review committees, but not the activist group. The Krever group came through. So that was a great example. And Canada should use that not only for Canada, but for the world, to say, to have WHO or others come and collaborate to say, these are the kinds of situations that we need to have a Krever type thing investigating and working on, be it pollution, be it long incubation period diseases, but certainly long incubation period phenomena. For me, the incubation is key. If it's a long phenomena, in Canada or the United States, where you have people elected for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever periods of time, 10-year incubation period disease doesn't interest them much. And to be honest, in the private sector, 10-year incubation period phenomena for investments are not terribly interesting either. And so government needs to take the lead on these things, and how to have long incubation period committees, if you will, or interest groups, or that would constantly look at these things that are going to affect our children or their children. And our job is to make recommendations to protect our children's children. And the best way we can with today's data, and halfway between our children's children and today, we have a review of what scientific things we can apply that are now discovered, where we can apply tests to monitor their exposures or their whatever. And so we review that every 5 years. And say, what are the new things for our children's children and their children's children that we should have in place? And that, you know, to be honest, we could do that in health. And it would be a wonderful model for other things. Health is very broad, so it would involve pollution and this sorts of stuff, but it would also roads and whatever. You'd be surprised at what a benefit that would be to have the long-term committee looking at things regularly with long incubation or long, I call them incubation, but it's really long-term effect of an exposure to whatever it may be, would be very valuable for societies in general. And Canada could do that, and it would affect the world. You watch, the rest of the world would follow suit. My warning to Canadian government, not to mention governments of the world, is from the health side. Let me just stick the health side. As be very worried with things with long incubation periods that are longer than your elected official's term in office. So that there is a long incubation period, futuristic look at things that need to be intervened today to prevent our children and our children's children from acquiring diseases. And stick with things that have data, where you can make presumptive risk estimates. And if we don't have the data, then recommend that the data be collected for the ones that are out there that may be. And these are not terribly expensive, terribly difficult. But recognize, especially in academia, in elected officials, appointed officials, that things that have an outcome beyond your term of office are not very important to you. And what you need is a group that's looking at things that exceed your term of office. Because once you have an HIV situation with a 10-year incubation period, by the time you find it, the fire is burning and it's hell to stop. And so what you want is the long-term issues that are picked up early where you can intervene before it gets to be such a huge problem.